When HOA and Karen took over my land, I fought back in court and won. I have always loved this land, where my family has lived for generations. Every time I return from a long business trip, I always feel an indescribable joy because I know I will return to a peaceful place with fields of wheat stretching green and lush. However, after a business trip to Japan, where I had to work for a month to help a company with market development consulting, I never expected that this return would mark the biggest change in my life. The afternoon sunlight shone down, and I saw a sight I never expected. A massive concrete block stood tall before me, a three-story hotel with a shiny facade like a giant creature reaching up amid the wheat fields that I had once tended to. The glass panels reflected the sunlight like thousands of eyes watching me. A heavy feeling overwhelmed me. This was no longer my land. The familiar, warm landscape was now just a symbol of intrusion and takeover. I felt a tightness in my chest, an uncomfortable sensation as if I couldn't breathe. I stopped the car right on the gravel road. It felt like my heart was racing, not out of fear, but because of the anger building up inside me. A part of me wanted to turn around, drive away quickly, and forget everything, but I couldn't. This was my family's legacy. This was the place that raised me. I couldn't let a massive concrete block replace all the memories and hard work that my family had put into this land. I couldn't stand there doing nothing. With every passing second, my anger grew stronger. Standing there, watching that construction grow larger before my eyes, I felt like I was losing everything. How could I let someone else take the land my family had kept for generations? I decided to face this right away. Despite the surprise and discomfort I felt, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the construction site. The workers in protective gear walked back and forth, but none of them seemed to pay attention to me. I stopped in front of one worker standing near a signboard, looking at him with determination. I needed to clarify everything right now. "This is my family's land," I said, my voice not loud but powerful, showing calmness and determination. "I'm Michael Adams, the owner of this land." The worker looked at me, a little surprised, then quickly took a step back. "You're the owner?" he asked, his voice somewhat surprised but also uncomfortable. I could sense that he didn't know how to handle this situation. I didn't respond immediately, instead glancing at the signboard nearby. A name stood out clearly: Karen Mitchell, HOA president. Everything suddenly became clearer than ever. Memories of her sending letters complaining about the unpainted fence, the height of the grass not meeting regulations, and constant reminders about not following HOA rules flooded back. Karen had always found ways to put my family in difficult situations, but I never thought she would go this far. The land, this land, had long become something she wanted to take for herself. When I looked back at the sign, I could feel the coldness in her handwriting, as if she had completely taken ownership of everything here. There was no doubt now, this was Karen's doing. She had wanted to seize this land for a long time, but I never imagined she would take such drastic action. And now, this was the moment I had to face what I had let slip away all this time. As I stood facing the massive hotel, the anger and disappointment slowly turned into determination. This land was more than just property to me. It was the place my family had been rooted in for so many years, where my ancestors had worked and cared for every inch of soil. The memories of early mornings, when I worked the fields with my father, or the nights spent gathered around the family hearth, remained vivid in my mind. This wasn't just land. It was everything my family had built, our legacy to pass down to future generations. But now, a massive concrete structure was taking over that land. I couldn't just stand still and watch this intrusion. My resolve grew stronger as I remembered the times Karen Mitchell, the president of the HOA, had sent complaint letters about trivial things like the height of the grass or the fence that hadn't been repainted. Things that seemed insignificant to her, but to me, they were violations of my family's property rights. She had always tried to present herself as a serious community manager, but her actions always had a clear agenda. Karen's goal wasn't just to make the HOA perfect, it was to take over this land, and I started to realize she had gone too far. I couldn't let this happen again. I began thinking about ways to deal with it, and the help of Emily was exactly what I needed right now. She always had a sharp eye for detail and would definitely help me analyze everything accurately. I picked up my phone and sent her a message. "There's an emergency. Call me ASAP." The emptiness I had felt inside began to subside as I realized I wasn't alone in this fight. As soon as I got back into the car, I felt a surge of urgency. I couldn't just let things unfold without taking action. I began digging through old family documents, those that my grandfather had carefully kept for years. I clearly remembered him saying, "Knowledge is the most powerful weapon." These documents were not just old scraps of paper. They were invaluable evidence. With Emily by my side, we began going through the maps, meeting minutes, and letters my grandfather had both received and sent. Gradually, I realized these papers not only helped me understand the land my family owned, but also exposed the tricks HOA had used over the years. One map drawn by my grandfather in 1952 caught my attention. It meticulously outlined the boundaries of our land, with lines and notes that revealed a thorough preparation, a long-term plan to protect this property. These documents weren't just a legacy. They were weapons for me to fight for my rights. That map confirmed that this land could not be altered or seized without my family's consent. Then I discovered more documents, HOA meeting minutes, exchanges between HOA members and local authorities. All of them pointed to a tight connection between Karen and local real estate developers. In fact, I began to realize that the actions of HOA over the years were not random. This was a calculated strategy, and now I knew I had to fight, not only to reclaim my land, but also to stand against the wrongful decisions they had made in the shadows. When I walked into my office, the light from the small window shone in, but all I could think about was one thing: how to fight back against Karen Mitchell and HOA. I could feel the tension in every step, knowing that the documents I had gathered over the past few days were now the weapons I needed to use carefully. Each piece of paper, every map, every meeting minutes were not just worthless items, but powerful evidence to expose the shady actions of HOA and Karen. Emily had helped me organize these documents, sorting them by categories. She had a sharp eye, and as we reviewed each piece of the puzzle together, I could feel the tension and determination rising within me. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight for justice, for my family, and for what rightfully belonged to me. Karen thought she could take everything from me without facing resistance, but she was wrong. With Emily's help, I began reaching out to a few people in the community who could support me in this fight. One of them was David Parker, a lawyer I had researched through local friends. David was tough and smart, and I felt reassured when he agreed to help me. From the very first meeting, he understood the situation and provided invaluable legal advice. David wasn't just a lawyer. He had experience in land disputes. He helped me build a detailed legal strategy, step by step. We weren't just going to rebut HOA's evidence, but we were also going to point out the weaknesses in their file. Together with the documents from my grandfather, we would prove that HOA and Karen's actions were not only legally wrong, but also violated my family's fundamental rights. Every time David and I discussed, I felt my confidence grow. Just as my grandfather had said, knowledge is the most powerful weapon. As this battle began to unfold, I realized something important. This wasn't just my fight. It was the fight of the entire community. Neighbors started coming to me, sharing their own stories about how Karen and HOA had made life difficult for them. Some had been afraid to speak out, but now they saw an opportunity to stand up against those who abused their power. The more people from the community joined the fight, the more I felt I was no longer alone. And that was my greatest strength. With the support of Emily, David, and the community around me, I felt the power of a strategy built on evidence, testimonies, and a sense of fairness. I started to realize that this fight wouldn't just be a personal one. It would become a struggle for the rights of all the residents in the area, those who had been threatened by the abuse of power and influence. That realization pushed me to keep fighting, not just to protect my family, but to protect justice within the community. After getting everything ready, David Parker, my lawyer, and I began crafting a strategy for the direct confrontation with Karen Mitchell and HOA. This was no longer just about land ownership. This was a fight to protect my family from the abuse of power by people like Karen. David had reviewed the documents I found, and we decided to organize an official meeting to demand that Karen and the HOA members explain their actions, particularly the construction of the hotel on my family's land without consent. As I entered the meeting room, the air was thick with tension. Karen sat at the head of the table, her expression like a wolf waiting for its prey. The HOA members looked at me with cautious glances, as if I were the one causing a disturbance. I didn't feel pressured. The documents and evidence I brought with me had been prepared for a long time, and now was the time to fight for justice. "Hello, Mr. Adams," Karen spoke, her tone sharp and filled with disdain. "I think you'll understand that this project has been approved, and it's a major step forward for our area. This will benefit the community greatly." I didn't hesitate to interrupt her. "This isn't about the community, Karen. It's about your personal interests and those of your colleagues in the HOA. I don't care about your development projects. I only care about how you violated my family's legal ownership." Karen tried to remain calm, but I could sense the tension in her eyes. She began flipping through the documents as though nothing was wrong. "You're misunderstanding this, Mr. Adams. This is a decision that was approved by the city government. We can't stop just because of a few trivial requests." "You can't stop because you think you have the right, but you've forgotten that my family's rights are protected by the law," I replied, my voice firm. "I have enough evidence to prove that everything you've done is illegal. What you're saying is just an excuse to cover up your greed." I pulled out my grandfather's old map from 1952, detailing the boundaries of our land, and placed it on the table in front of Karen. "This is our evidence. My family has owned this land for generations, and you have no right to change that." Karen looked at the map, trying to maintain her composure, but I could see her beginning to hesitate. My words were clearly not easy for her to brush off. She knew well that I wasn't an easy opponent, and these documents were powerful weapons in this fight. "You think that with an old map you can change everything?" Karen tried to speak, but her voice wasn't as certain as before. "It's not just an old map, Karen. This is my family's history. It's a legal right that you cannot violate, and I won't let you or the HOA do so without facing legal consequences," I replied, unwavering. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. HOA members started exchanging nervous glances. I could feel that subtle but important change. Michael Adams, the simple farmer they once thought could be easily pushed around, was standing up and fighting back with everything he had. The confrontation in the meeting room grew more intense. I had presented strong evidence, and there was no room for avoidance anymore. Karen continued flipping through the documents, but I could clearly see the worry in her eyes. My words were no longer easy for her to ignore, as she once thought. It felt like every word I said was a direct blow to her arguments. "You can't just turn this around because of these documents," Karen said, her voice weaker now. "We have the approval from the government. Everything is legitimate. You can't change that with just a few pages." "I'm not changing anything," I responded, my eyes never leaving hers. "I just want you to understand that what you and the HOA are doing is wrong, and I will not let this continue without resistance." The room fell silent. Karen seemed to start feeling the pressure, and she could no longer deny the truth. The HOA members began exchanging glances, and those who had once been complicit with Karen now seemed to have some doubts. This gave me the feeling that I could maintain the upper hand in this confrontation. Karen looked at me again, trying to maintain her confidence. "You won't win this, Mr. Adams. We followed the correct procedures. Then can you explain why you never informed my family about the land zoning changes?" I asked. "Can you explain why we never received a meeting notice or an official announcement from the HOA regarding this project?" Karen didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, her eyes full of unease. This was a clear sign that she knew she could no longer justify her actions. My challenge had made her uneasy. Finally, Karen sighed and lowered her voice. "I think we'll need more time to review everything," she said, trying to regain her composure. "Let's let this meeting continue, and we'll make a decision afterward." I didn't answer right away, but simply stared at her for a moment. I knew this wasn't the end, But at least I had made one thing clear. This fight wouldn't be easy for Karen and the HOA. I had forced them to confront the truth and start questioning what they had done. "We'll see, Karen," I replied, not forgetting to look at her with determination. "I won't stop until everything is resolved fairly." After the tense confrontation with Karen Mitchell, I knew I couldn't fight this battle alone. What mattered now wasn't just a legal battle, but building collective strength, a powerful support force from the community. If I wanted to win, I needed the support of those who had been oppressed by the HOA, those who had witnessed Karen and the HOA's manipulation and injustice. I decided to hold a meeting with the residents in the area, especially those who had suffered from the HOA's oppression in the past. This wasn't just a regular gathering. It was an opportunity for the community and me to share our stories, assert our rights, and stand together to fight against the abuse of power. This meeting would be a turning point where people could better understand the schemes of Karen and the HOA and build a strong force to rise up for justice. That evening, I invited everyone who could participate and share their story to a small cafe in the area. The space was cozy but tense as people started to gather. Mr. Henderson, my longtime neighbor, was the first to arrive. He was a simple but strong man, having lived in this area for many years, and was one of the first to feel the change in how HOA was being run under Karen's leadership. "Michael, I've heard about your situation," Mr. Henderson said, looking at me with understanding in his eyes. "You're not the only one she's made life difficult for. I've been asked to change fences, alter the plants, and there's never been a good reason for those requests. It's all because she wants to control everything." I nodded. Knowing Mr. Gore, Henderson understood the situation very well. This was why I needed his help, as well as the help of other residents. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Henderson. If you don't mind, I'd like you to share your story at this meeting. Your support will be invaluable in this fight." Mr. Henderson nodded, not saying anything further, but his gaze showed determination. More people began to arrive, and the conversation started to heat up. The residents in the area didn't just want to hear my story, but also wanted to share their own experiences with the HOA. A woman named Mary, who lived not far from my house, stood up and began speaking. "I've lived here for over 20 years, and I've never seen a change as drastic as this. The HOA's demands have become excessive. Karen sent me letters asking me to do this and that, as if I were a lawbreaker. But when I asked about the regulations, they couldn't give me a reasonable answer. Everything was vague and unclear." Mary continued to tell how she was asked to change the wall dividing her house from the neighbors without any valid reason, simply because the HOA deemed it didn't meet the community standards. They never clarified the regulations, they just imposed their demands from above without consulting the residents. And I began to realize that this wasn't just about community management, it was a campaign to profit from their power. Mary's story not only highlighted the wrongdoings of the HOA, but it also reinforced my belief that I wasn't alone in this fight. The people in the room began looking at each other, realizing that it wasn't just me facing this injustice. Many others were also suffering from the decisions of the HOA, with no way to protest. The sense of unity began to spark. I then reinforced the purpose of the meeting. We're not just standing up to protect our own rights, but also to protect the rights of everyone who's been mistreated by the HOA. Those who have been pushed into difficult situations by Karen and the others in the HOA. They think we're weak and that we can't do anything. But I believe that if we fight together, we can change everything. My words were met with strong agreement from those around me. Nods of approval, quiet applause, all signs that the community was beginning to unite. By sharing our stories, we not only exposed Karen's schemes, but also proved that the HOA's opposition wasn't a personal issue, but a collective one affecting the entire community. After the meeting with Karen and the HOA, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Although I had made some progress in dealing with the HOA's manipulation, I knew this battle wasn't over. There was still much to uncover, and I couldn't rely solely on the documents I had. I needed to find the connections, the relationships between the HOA and local real estate developers, those who might be behind this entire plan. One late evening, As I was sitting in my office trying to organize the documents I had gathered, I stumbled upon an old contract in a file box my grandfather had stored. It was a contract between the HOA and a local real estate company, a company I had never heard of before. The contract discussed the development of land near my area, and what surprised me was that the terms in this contract seemed unclear. I felt something was very wrong. Why would a land development contract be signed without the involvement or discussion with landowners like myself? I couldn't let this slip by without further investigation. I needed more information, and I knew the person who could help me was Emily. I called Emily immediately. "Can you come over right now?" I asked as she answered the phone. "There's a very important document, and I need your help analyzing it." An hour later, Emily arrived at my house. She was patient and always had a sharp eye for detail. Together, we began reviewing the contract and other documents. After looking it over, Emily sighed and looked at me, her gaze full of doubt. "Michael, there's something fishy about this contract. Not only are the terms unclear, but the conditions regarding land zoning might be the key. If what we're seeing is true, then the HOA is orchestrating a big plan to profit from real estate development projects without being transparent with the community." "You're right," I replied, my heart sinking. "Both the HOA and Karen may have teamed up with local developers to seize our land without informing us. This isn't just a small scam, it's a long-term strategy. But if that's the case, we need to prove this connection." Emily flipped through a few more pages of the documents, then pointed to a company name on one of the sheets. "This is the real estate company I've seen in the previous documents. This name appears multiple times in the HOA records. I think we need to dig deeper into this company." I nodded. "Then we need to dive into this. But we must be careful. A small mistake could make us lose this opportunity." We spent the whole night analyzing the documents, page by page, searching for connections and potential evidence. The tense conversations between Emily and me not only helped us identify crucial clues, but also strengthened my resolve. Things began to become clearer as I discovered that this real estate company not only had close ties with the HOA, but also had many connections with local government officials. This was the evidence I needed to bring the truth to light. "Michael, look at this." Emily pointed to a line on a document. "This is a copy of an official meeting they held with top local government officials. They're trying to use these relationships to influence land zoning decisions without informing the community." My heart raced. This was our opportunity. All these connections were the missing pieces to the puzzle. I knew I had uncovered a significant weakness in Karen and the HOA's plan. "We have to act quickly," I said, feeling the heat of the truth rising within me. "If everything we found is true, we'll have enough grounds to take them to court. What we need now is the community's unity and solid legal evidence." Emily and I continued to search for more evidence, and I began to build a new, stronger legal strategy based on what we had uncovered. This was a pivotal moment in my legal battle. I wasn't just fighting for my family anymore. I was fighting for the whole community, the people who had been manipulated by Karen and the HOA for so long. The confrontation between Karen Mitchell and me had now become inevitable. After days of collecting documents, analyzing evidence, and developing strategies, I was finally ready to face Karen and the HOA members in an official meeting. This wasn't just any regular meeting. It was my opportunity to prove that every action taken by Karen and the HOA was illegal and threatened the rights of my family and the people in this community. On that day, I walked into the meeting room with a strong yet calm feeling. Karen sat at the head of the table, her expression no longer smug as it once was, though she still tried to maintain an air of authority. The HOA members sat silently, unwilling to meet my eyes. I could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation. "I think we've had quite a long meeting, and now it's time to wrap this up," Karen said, trying to maintain her confident tone. But I knew she was nervous, and the urgency in her voice indicated she realized she was being backed into a corner. "That's right," I replied, not missing the chance. "We'll wrap this up, but not the way you think." I placed a stack of documents in front of her, the ones that Emily and I had carefully organized. Each sheet was evidence of Karen and the HOA's manipulation. I didn't just have evidence about the land, but also a series of meetings and documents related to the covert relationships between the HOA and real estate developers that she had been involved with. Most notably, the contract I found between the HOA and a real estate company, one of the strongest pieces of evidence. You can look through this and explain to me why there's a land development contract here without informing my family about any changes to the zoning? I asked, my voice full of defiance yet firm. Karen quickly flipped through the documents, but the unease was evident on her face. You don't understand the issue. This is a project that has been approved by the authorities, she tried to explain. I understand it very well, I interrupted her. This is not just a development project. This is an abuse of power to seize the property of residents without informing them. Don't think that your decisions can go unchallenged. Karen began to fumble, feeling defensive. This is just a misunderstanding. The procedures were followed correctly. You don't have the right to stop us. I don't need your permission, I responded sharply. You may grant yourself power, but that power doesn't stand above the law. My family has owned this land for generations, and I won't let you continue to violate it. My words weren't just a condemnation of Karen's actions. They were a public declaration that I wouldn't back down. In the tense atmosphere, I saw some members of the HOA exchanging glances, as if they were starting to doubt the legality of the decisions Karen had made. A few of them began to realize that they couldn't continue standing by her. Karen could no longer maintain her smug confidence. Mr. Adams, she said, her voice weakening, we can't just keep going like this. This project is for the benefit of the community, not for your personal gain. If you don't agree, we'll have to proceed with the legal steps. You can proceed any time you want, I replied, my voice resolute, but you won't be able to do this without facing the consequences. A few seconds of silence passed before one of the board members spoke up. Karen, we need to review everything carefully. It seems there are things we don't fully understand. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The atmosphere in the room grew tense, and I knew that the battle was no longer just between me and Karen. A small shift in the attitude of the HOA members, along with the documents I had provided, had started to shake Karen's control. After I discovered the important documents about the covert relationships between the HOA and real estate developers, I knew I had gathered enough evidence to expose the truth. The documents my grandfather left behind, along with the evidence Emily and I had collected, had created a powerful blow that Karen and the HOA couldn't continue to cover up their wrongdoings. Now I had to do one important thing: bring all this evidence to light. I decided to invite the residents of the area to a community meeting. I couldn't fight this battle alone, and I knew the community was the key to turning the tide. One evening, I stood in front of the mirror, staring into the darkness, thinking about what was about to unfold. This was my opportunity to not only protect my family, but also to help everyone in the community understand the truth. When the meeting began, I was ready. Placing the documents and evidence on the table, I saw the skeptical looks from the crowd. A few people had already grown impatient and began speaking up. Michael, is what you're saying really true? Someone from the community asked. It turns out we've been manipulated all this time? I nodded, not feeling worried. Yes, that's the truth. HOA has used their power to seize our property without following any public process. What I'm showing you today will help you understand what's been going on. We began to share our stories. Mr. Henderson, my neighbor, was the first to stand up. Karen forced me to change the wall around my house just because she wanted it. I didn't get any reasonable explanation. It's all power manipulation. I see now I'm not the only one. Everyone in the room nodded in agreement. Their stories made it clearer than ever that not just my family, but many others in the area had suffered from the manipulation of HOA. A woman named Mary stood up and continued. I've received letters asking me to change my fence with no clear reason. And when I asked them for information on the regulations, they would avoid answering. When I asked about the HOA's development project, they never gave me a clear response. At that moment, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The hesitation and silence were gone. People began to speak up, and the outrage in the community was spreading. We had been pushed to the wall, and now it was time for us to stand up and protect our rights. I turned to look at everyone, feeling the strength of unity growing. What we're doing here is not just for my family, but for everyone who has been mistreated by the HOA. If we don't stand up now, no one will protect us anymore. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense. The residents began to realize that they were no longer the weak side in this fight. We had found strength in our unity, and now we had enough evidence and determination to expose the wrongdoings of Karen and the HOA. After the meeting, I started sharing the documents on social media, and soon our story spread throughout the community. The accusations about HOA's power manipulation and Karen's actions became louder, sparking a wave of outrage. People began to recognize the truth, and the anger spread like wildfire. Karen, who had always considered herself to have absolute power in the community, could no longer maintain her confidence. She began to realize that this time, she couldn't control everything like before. The HOA members started exchanging worried glances. Phone calls from the authorities and real estate developers she had ties with started becoming more tense. Especially when the accusations about shady dealings were made public, Karen's anxiety began to show. With every phone call and meeting, I could clearly feel her losing control. Once again, I proved that nothing could stop the truth. I wasn't just fighting for my family, I was fighting for fairness and transparency, which the community deserved. Karen and the HOA couldn't maintain their grip on power, and I wouldn't stop until everything was made clear. After uncovering the hidden secrets of the HOA and Karen, I knew it was time to take this fight to the next level. I had gathered enough evidence, documents, meetings, and community support to prove that every decision Karen and the HOA had made was illegal. I finally decided to take the case to court. This would be the final legal battle, where everything I had worked for would be proven in front of the law. Emily, my lawyer, and the community worked together to develop a detailed plan for this fight. She had been with me throughout this journey, and I knew her support would be decisive in this legal battle. She had studied every document, every meeting I had recorded, and prepared the defenses to protect the rights of my family and the residents in the area. The day of the final trial arrived, and I could feel the tension in the air. I walked into the courtroom, where many residents from the area had come to support me. The community stood by my side, fighting against the injustice they had endured for so many years. The residents who had been mistreated by the HOA, from fence alterations to unreasonable demands, now stood united with me, ready to testify in this court. The courtroom witnessed a fiery battle between the prosecution and the defense. Karen sat across from me, still trying to maintain her confidence, but I could see the anxiety in her eyes. Although she tried to deny everything and blame me and the community, Emily and I had prepared far too thoroughly. Every document, every story from the community, every piece of evidence I brought was a powerful blow to Karen and her team's arguments. We're not just fighting for the rights of my family, I began in the courtroom, but for the fairness of the entire community. Karen and the HOA have manipulated power to profit from decisions that were not transparent or publicly disclosed. Their actions are an abuse of power, and it needs to stop today. Emily stood beside me, strong and confident, continuing to present strong evidence of the HOA's illegal decisions regarding the residents. She pointed out that no official meetings had been held to inform the community about development projects, and all zoning changes had been made without the consent of the residents. Karen, trying to maintain her smug attitude, could not deny the evidence Emily and I had presented. "Mr. Adams doesn't understand the issue," Karen said, attempting to downplay everything. "We followed all the proper procedures, and this project is for the benefit of the community." But her words no longer held weight. The community members began speaking up in the courtroom, recounting their painful experiences with the HOA. The room fell silent as each person stood up to share their story of how they were forced to make changes and penalized for unreasonable actions. These people weren't just witnesses. They were individuals who had lived with the injustice and abuse of power from the HOA for years. At that moment, I felt the power of unity within the community growing stronger. The testimonies from the residents not only reinforced the evidence I had presented, but also showed the determination of all of us to push back against the abuse of power. We stood up not only for our own families, but for everyone who had ever been made to suffer under the HOA. After months of perseverance and relentless fighting, we finally won the legal battle. When the court declared that the HOA and Karen had violated the law in their land grab and abuse of power, I felt an enormous weight lifted from my shoulders. This verdict wasn't just a victory for my family, but for all those who had suffered from the injustice of the HOA. Karen, once the symbol of arrogance and manipulation, had finally faced the consequences of her wrongful actions. The documents and evidence I had gathered, along with the unwavering support from the community, had rendered her incapable of defending her actions. The key members of the HOA, those who had been complicit with Karen all along, also had to take responsibility and face the legal repercussions. The court decided to halt all illegal development projects the HOA had carried out, including the hotel project on my family's land. The land ownership rights of my family and the surrounding residents were restored, and the plans Karen and the HOA had laid out to seize our properties were completely nullified. This was a moment where I felt like I had completed my mission, but I also realized that this victory was not just mine or my family's. It was for all the residents in this community. The people in the community, those who had stood by me and shared their stories, began to feel the change. Their land, the properties they once feared would be stolen, were now legally protected. The residents no longer had to live in fear of the unreasonable demands from the HOA. They started to look at each other with new eyes, no longer as oppressed individuals, but as winners in the battle against injustice. The feeling I had when I saw the community starting to change was indescribable. The fences, the absurd regulations, and the pressures the HOA had created over the years were no longer there. People began talking to one another, sharing stories about the change and the hope for the future. I knew that, though the battle wasn't fully over, this victory had created a major turning point, not just for my family, but for all those who had been made to suffer under the HOA's abuse of power. The community had regained its legal rights, and we began to feel the freedom and fairness that had been denied to us for so long. Michael not only protected his family, but also sparked a wave of justice for those who had been wronged by the HOA in the past. The struggles were never easy, but the final outcome showed that persistence and courage can defeat the abuse of power. "This isn't just my victory," I said in a community meeting after the court ruling. "This is our victory. If we hadn't stood up, if we hadn't come together, justice would have never won. Each of us has the right to be protected, and no one can take that away." The community clapped, and our unity was affirmed in that moment. Everyone understood that, even though the battle was over, what we had started would never be extinguished. Michael's struggle had become a symbol of perseverance, courage, and the determination to fight for justice in the community. I felt proud that I never gave up, and I knew that this community would never again allow those in power to harm us. As everything settled down, I stood on my family's land, gazing at the vast fields that still greeted the morning light. We had won, but this victory was not just for my family. It was a victory for everyone who had endured the abuse of power, for the community I had helped build from the very beginning. I hadn't just protected this land, but I had also safeguarded the values we had upheld for generations. Seeing the residents of the area now living in freedom and fairness, I knew I had done the right thing. Those who had once been controlled by the HOA were now free to make their own decisions, no longer fearing unreasonable demands. HOA meetings were no longer a place where Karen and her accomplices manipulated everything. They had become a place where the community could come together to make decisions, building the area with transparency and trust. As I walked into my home, where everything had begun, I felt a sense of pride, not just for my family, but for all the people who fought alongside me. I had not stood alone in this battle. The community had stood by me, bravely facing their fears, and together we made a change. All the people in this area had made me realize that the strength of unity is unbreakable. "We've won, Michael," Emily said, standing beside me, her smile full of pride. But this victory isn't the end. It's the beginning of a new era for our community. What we've done will forever be a lesson for future generations. I nodded, unable to say more. This was when I felt most the power of persistence. It wasn't an easy fight, and I had sacrificed a lot. But a fight for justice is always worth it. I never gave up, and now everything we did had brought the results we deserved. Looking at this area, I could clearly see that justice doesn't just come from court decisions or the law. It comes from the determination of those who stand up to protect what is right. And if we hold on to our beliefs and never accept injustice, we will always find a way to win. Finally, I turned back to look at my family's land, the place where I and the generations before me had worked hard. It was not just land. It was proof of the power of persistence and courage. It was a reminder to me that no matter how powerful the forces we face, if we unite, protect justice, and never give up, we will always prevail.